Hello, everyone, and welcome to the housing policy session. I'd like to introduce Scott, who specializes in on-reserve housing as well as financial management. His extensive experience in housing, finance, and accounting will allow him to provide expert advice on such topics as CMHC Section 95 management, setting up housing authorities, financing large housing projects, home ownership, and property management. He also provides CMHC workshops on a property management and administration, as well as consulting for First Nation Market Housing Fund. Mr. Fleeman resides in Ricky, unceded territory on Manitoulin Island in Ontario. With his family, enjoys the outdoors in his spare time.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew. Hi, everybody. Ani, everybody. My name is Scott Fleeman. I'm calling from phoning in from Wikmunkong on Manitoulin Island. It's a pleasure presenting at the conference. I haven't done it in 2 years. Now, I've been in the housing industry for over 20 years, 10 with CMHC and 10 as a consultant. So I do quite a bit of consulting for First Nations Market Housing Fund as well as CMHC. So on average, I do about, I'd say about anywhere from 8 to 10 housing policies a year, and including updating and training staff and training housing committees and training chief and councils. As a matter of fact, right after this call, I have to join a chief and council meeting on their new housing policy. So it's housing policy all day. So in this brief 45-minute presentation, what I'm going to do is kind of give you a synopsis of what can go into housing policy and what stuff should be in there, and some suggestions that you can use in your housing policy. So we'll talk a little bit about the purpose of a housing policy. When I always talk to people about housing policy, a lot of people are under the misconception that a housing policy is designed to evict people, and in fact, it's not. The main purpose, really, of a housing policy, if it's properly implemented and enforced and people are trained on how to manage it, it's used to make your houses last longer. Why can't houses on reserve last 30, 40 years long? They can. It's just implementing a proper housing policy. And it's about educating band members. So I'm big on educating band members. So what does the housing policy do? Well, it provides a framework to deliver housing to all band members in a manner that's unbiased, transparent, and fair. So how does a housing policy do that? So some of the suggestions I do to make it transparent and fair is that we do scoring. We score new housing allocations based on scoring. We look at need. We look at how your current living situation. We look at your affordability analysis to make sure you can afford these houses. And the way we want to be transparent is fair. I always promote anonymous scoring. And the way that's done is housing would score housing applications. And then when it goes to the committee for selection or to the chief and council, I always recommend that rather than putting names on a spreadsheet with their score, what they do is you just put a random number and their scores. So chief and council, the housing committee, does not know who they're looking at. And this serves two purposes. One, there's no personal biases involved in the selection criteria. And secondly, because I deal with a lot of small communities, as you know, in small communities, well, that's my cousin, that's my sister. So by doing anonymous scoring, people on the housing committee, people on chief and council do not have to declare conflict of interest when they're doing selection. That way, my brother, my sister, my daughter can apply for housing. I don't have to recuse myself from the housing committee or chief and council, because anonymous scoring means I don't know who they are on that selection process. So the only time I know who it is when the final selection. So we'll say, okay, number 3 scored 12 points. We'll award number 3. And then once the selection is made, then housing says, okay, number 3 was Scott Fleeman or Andrew, and then that's how we remain transparent. The other thing we want to do is the scoring. The scoring, it's not a secret document. It's not a top secret document. It's a public document. It's included in the housing policy. And when I do community presentations, I review the scoring. So actually people can score their own housing applications before they submit it. You don't need an MBA. You don't need to be a rocket scientist. It's pretty straightforward. So we look at affordability, we look at current living conditions, and we look at how big your family is and whether they're all band members. So all of these are factored into a score. And again, we want to demonstrate to membership that we're treating everybody equally. Some of the communities I visit, their selection processes are very unusual. Some of them, one per family. There might be 7 major families on our community, so each family member would get from each 7. And I actually ran into one community where I worked with where it was a community vote. So the way it worked was the larger families, if we had a large family and there was a housing selection, they would have a community meeting and people would vote, should Scott get a house? Well, Scott would get a house if I invited all 30 of my cousins in to come and vote for me. So which is kind of unfair, and you had single people getting these houses. So we kind of came in there, did the scoring, and it was unanimously accepted by the community because they thought it was fair, because we had families on waiting lists and we were giving houses to people that were, that had more bedrooms houses. The other thing we want to do in housing policy, we're not going to score everybody. So when we have housing become available, we're going to make sure they match the occupancy that they're going in. For example, if it's a 2-bedroom house, we are not going to put a family of 8 in a 2-bedroom house. That's overcrowding. On the other extreme, we're not going to put a single person in a 4-bedroom house. That's called overhousing. That means there's more bedrooms than people. So in that situation, we want to use the national occupancy standards, where children of the same sex can share rooms. Children of the opposite sex can share the same room until they reach the age of 5, after which we'll split them. So that's what we use as overcrowding. Again, some of the goals we want to build safe, affordable housing, energy efficient. Again, when we talk about energy efficient, this is very important that the housing policy is used to complement your building construction. The reason is, with the building code that we have today, the houses are so airtight. As a matter of fact, there may not be an exhaust fan in the bathroom, in the kitchen. So the only exhaust fan is that HRV. And if you do not educate band members what a HRV does, not to turn it off, then what's going to happen is mold. I've seen it a lot of times where people have turned off that HRV. Again, this goes back to our housing policy, educating band members on the housing policy. And the way you teach band members is actually through a move-in inspection. When you do a move-in inspection, I always tell bands, you got to do a mini maintenance workshop. So you're moving in, this is a move-in inspection. By the way, this is how you change a breaker. This is how you change a stove oven. This is a HRV. Do not turn it off. This is how you set the controls. So you got to make sure this is taught. Again, this is done through the housing policy. The other thing we want to look at in the housing policy is education. In the move-in inspection, one of the biggest things causes of mold actually is something that can be stopped very easily. And that's hanging blankets in the window. When I worked at CMHC, we always had a grand opening in a community. That evening, we'd come back and what's on the windows? It's blankets, and that causes mold, right? That causes condensation on the window, premature failure of the window, and mold. So all of that has to be educated to band members, and you do that through a housing policy, through maintenance brochures, and through tenant handbooks. So it's very important that we educate our members. Then we want to develop a proper maintenance plan to ensure minimum. Again, how do we do that? Well, it's very simple. Included in your housing policy is a number of things that we can use to make sure that we maintain. First one is annual inspections. We're going to do annual inspections on the units. Secondly, we're going to enforce tenant-related damage. Why should the band pay for a window that you busted or a door that you kicked down? Should the band be responsible for? So again, we're going back to the housing policy and doing tenant-related damage. If you cannot afford to fix the damage that you did, what we would do then is do a repayment plan. So if you kick in your door, you bust your window, it's $600. We can work out a repayment plan. You pay extra $100 a month to reimburse the band for the window and door. The other thing too is on a maintenance inspection, when we do annual inspections, we're going to catch all these little things before they turn into large items. For example, if you have a leaky faucet in the bathroom, you don't fix it. Well, that little seal only costs 10 cents to fix. But if you don't fix it that first year, 5 years later, guess what? It's now an $8,000 job. There's mold underneath. You got to get a new vanity. You got a new subfloor. All of that, $8,000. It could have been saved by doing an annual inspection and replacing that seal. So this is why annual inspections and using your housing policy. By doing this, we're going to extend the useful life of our housing stock. So our housing stock can last 30, 40, maybe 50 years. Why can't it last? And that's through education and proper maintenance planning. And then the other thing we want to do is we want to promote home ownership. I'm big on home ownership because I work with First Nations Market Housing Fund. But prior to that, I was always big on home ownership because I always advocated bands to do rent to own, because rent to own by nature, if people know that they're going to own the house, guess what? They're going to take care of it. They're not going to put holes in the wall. They're going to do the landscaping. They're going to do the painting. They're going to maintain it. If you told me this is a rental and I'm never going to own it, then there's no real responsibility by the tenant to take ownership. So that's why I'm a big advocate of rent to own housing. I think it's a great option for home ownership. Again, what are the elements? There's basically, I've seen housing policies comes in all forms and shapes, but basically it boils down to 4 basic areas. Again, governance, rental own, renovations, and appeals. And then you have your appendix section dealing with home ownership. So we're going to talk about governance. Again, I'm just going to put some suggestions what you should put in your housing policy. It's not the law. It's not something you have to have. But again, suggestions based on all my years of work in housing. These are some of the things I think work if properly implemented. So we'll talk about each of them. So we talked about the housing committee, obviously not there to do, not have direct day-to-day responsibility. That's the responsibility of the housing department. They maintain, they do the arrears letters, they do the tenant selection. Again, you select the tenants based on scoring. And number 3, guess what? That is their biggest responsibility. They're supposed to review that housing policy every year and update it. If you update that every year, you will never need to hire a consultant to update your policy. You might want to figure out, somebody needs to take notes, what worked, what didn't work. Maybe our arrears policy is too lenient. Maybe we have to bring it in. Maybe people are abandoning their units and they're not telling you what should we put in the policy. So you want to make sure it's updated annually. And you want to provide advice to housing department and chief and council on all matters related to housing. Again, because you're a recommending body, you should bring some knowledge of housing and housing issues to the committee that you can advise housing, and chief and council. So housing department, again, responsible day-to-day operations. Now, I forgot to mention on the housing committee, normally a lot of communities that I work with do not have a terms of reference. So I actually build the terms of reference right into the housing policy, and then I'll have a governance section, and then that's where I'll put the terms of reference for the housing committee, like who can sit on it, how long is their term, is their honorary, all of that would be included in the housing policy. Again, housing department day-to-day operations, prepare arrears letters, keep chief and council and housing committee up to date on any funding opportunities, provide construction updates, ensure reports are prepared, and then score all housing applications. Again, they would use that anonymous form. Again, there's a long list. I'm not going to read the job description of the housing department, but these are some of the key elements that I would put in the housing policy in terms of basic responsibilities. And then we look at the governance, the chairperson. Normally, the chairperson is usually the councillor responsible for housing, or they vote. Again, maintain order, call for recommendations, keep the agenda on topic. Again, all of that would be highlighted in the governance piece, highlighting who's chairperson, how long they serve, who acts in the absence of a chairperson. All of that would be included in governance. Well, what about the tenant? What's their responsibility? Well, how about pay rent regularly and on time? I mean, really, that's our main goal. And then keep the house in good condition, clean and free of clutter. Again, we'll verify that through annual inspections. Not sublet or assign any band unit without permission of the band. Some bands do not allow any subletting, but there is some subletting happening in communities, so we do have a policy for that. Pay all utilities and not do any alterations without the approval of the housing department. I've seen a lot of horror stories where tenants have done modifications to the house. For example, I was in one community where the band member actually took out a load-bearing wall, so they had to be evacuated from the house. So it's very important that these annual inspections, we do them every year and we catch all of this stuff, because a lot of times band members are not going to call the band office when they want to do a renovation. They'll just do it. Again, respect the rights and privacy of neighbors. Notify housing of any damage or repairs. Again, this is a big one. When I have community meetings, I always mention to band members, it's very important that you tell the band office when something's broken. We don't care who broke it, especially if it's plumbing, heating, electrical, you got to tell us. Again, enter into a repayment plan. What about you must not cultivate or smoke cannabis from a band-owned unit? How is that legal? Well, even though it's legal to smoke and cultivate cannabis, you can still ban it from your band-owned unit under a couple of reasons. One, smoking. You can ban the smoking of tobacco as a fire hazard. Now, how is banning people from cultivating cannabis legal? Well, growing cannabis requires a lot of hydration, which leads to mold. So again, it's a health and safety issue. So even if you don't have a community-wide cannabis policy, you can still prevent people from doing stuff in band-owned units, because at the end of the day, it's still a band unit. Again, some tenants are responsible for content. Most of the bands I work with, they only have fire insurance for structure. So if tenants want to get covered for their contents, they have to get it on their own. Again, what about the application? Well, most applications, we have to be careful here on the application page, because not only we have to have it legal, but the other thing we have to, in Ontario, especially in other provinces out west, is you have to comply with Ontario Human Rights or Human Rights Commission of each province. Now, normally it would be 18 years of age or older. However, in Ontario, there's an exception. In Ontario, we have to put 18 years old with the exception of 16 or 17-year-olds who've withdrawn from parental control. We can accept applications. If we do not put that clause in there, then we're putting the ban at liability, and it's called age discrimination. Even though they're not 18, if they can prove they've withdrawn from parental control, we can accept their application. Well, how does housing do that? Well, actually, there's one department in the ban office that does that for you. It's called Ontario Works or welfare. If a 16 or 17-year-old is in receipt of welfare, that means they've withdrawn from parental control. Does that mean they'll get a house? Because a lot of chief and councils, they see that clause, and a lot of them are worried, you know, we're going to have a 16 or 7. No, that's not going to happen. When we do housing policy, we want to make sure we're not putting the ban in a liability position. The same extreme under home ownership. If a 70-year-old qualifies for a mortgage, the ban cannot say no on the basis of because he's 70 years old. The house is going to be paid off when he's 95. No, you still have to guarantee his mortgage. Because if we did, we better get a good lawyer because he's going to take us to the cleaners under age discrimination. So it works both ways for young people and old people in housing. Again, the other thing, complete the housing application and update it annually. I always recommend that they update it annually because circumstances change. People's families grow, maybe you got a new job. And a lot of the bands I work with, even though CMHC says it's flat rent, no income testing, you know what? You still got to verify that that person can afford that rent. I have a lot of communities that put people in these houses and they cannot afford the rent. Even though the rent may be, you know, $400 or $500, they still cannot afford it because they don't make enough money. So we're just setting them up for failure. So it's important that you do income testing. And the way you do it, it's pretty straightforward. So if you have a pen and paper, you should write this down. You take their, if they're working people, you take their gross monthly income divided by their monthly rent. And if their factor is 3.0 or higher, guess what? They're spending less than 1/3 of their income on housing, which means in theory, they should afford that house. If it's below 3.0, that means they're paying 50% of their income to housing. Guess what? They still have to pay utilities. They have to buy groceries. You know what? They can't afford that unit. If someone's on welfare, the way you look at it is you take their shelter allowance plus their estimated utilities. The shelter allowance should equal the rent plus the estimate. So somebody has to estimate the utilities for that. So maybe the rent is 400 and the utilities are 150. So ideally, we want to make sure if someone goes in that unit, their shelter allowance should be at least greater than $550. Otherwise, you're going to have these people not being able to afford the rent or the utility. So again, income testing. Applicants with previous arrears are not eligible. You have to pay, and only band members eligible for rent-to-own. If you're in Ontario Works, not eligible for rent-to-owns. Again, the reason on rent-to-own, someone on Ontario Works at the time of application would not be eligible is under rent-to-own. There's a reasonable expectation that you, when you this mortgage is done, there's a reasonable expectation that you can afford the insurance and maintenance of this house. If you're on welfare, you cannot afford the insurance or maintenance. So that's why. So it's only at time of application. It's not at 5 years, 10 years after they got the house. Again, tenancy agreements. One of the things I talk about is you should do annual tenancy agreements. The reason you want to do that is you can put this clause in there that only tenants not in arrears are permitted to sign a new tenancy agreement on March 31st. So what does that mean? A lot of people thought there's a mass eviction. No, it doesn't happen. The exception is tenants who have signed a rental or arrears or recovery agreement. So they have to come in before March 31st, sign a rental or arrears recovery agreement, and they're allowed to stay beyond April 1st. So it's important that housing informs these people, these tenants, that, hey, it's March 1st, Scott, you're $450 in arrears. You got to either pay that off by March 31st or sign a rental arrears recovery agreement. Sorry about that. That's a mouth folder. Anyways, again, a lot of people think, Scott, there's going to be a massive eviction. Never happened. Again, you got to warn the people and let them know that this is happening. Again, we did talk about subletting, even though it's not allowed. A lot of First Nations are building in because it's happening anyway. So we built some criteria. Some of the things we look at, should it be just for any reason? No, we said there should be criteria. Why? Well, it could be health related. Maybe I need to be leave my community and be in Toronto for extended period of time due to medical reasons. Or education is the big one. I'm going back to University of Toronto. I'm going to school in Vancouver. I'm going to be away 4 years, but I want to come back. Or employment. Maybe I got a 2-year contract with Chibougamau. I'm from Wiki, so I'm going to move to Sioux Lookout or Kenora and work there for 2 years and come back. So there's always these possibilities that, you know, these guys are going to, because we do want them to come back. So the original tenancy remains in force. We let the original tenant pick their tenants. It has to be a band member. And by the way, whatever that band member does to your house, if they do tenant related damage, they don't pay rent, guess what? You're on the hook for everything. So if he busts all the windows, you're paying, and he doesn't pay, you're paying. So we want you to pick someone responsible. Pick your Aunt Mary, who goes to church every Sunday and pays her bills. Do not pick your cousin Scott, who likes to party and bring lots of friends over and does lots of damage. That's not a good idea, because at the end of the day, Scott's probably going to skip town with if the band's going to come, and then you're going to be left holding the bag. So again, you got to make sure that you pick someone. And the other thing, if you don't come back after 4 years, guess what? Bye-bye unit. You've pretty much, it'll be considered abandoned, and that tenant that you put in there does have no rights, so it would be reallocated by the housing department. Again, you got to come back. That's one of the main things. Again, rental housing criteria. Again, you got to match the occupancy of the home you're applying for. We talked about this. You don't want to put a family of 8 in a 2-bedroom. On the other extreme, you don't want to put a family of, with 1 child in a 5-bedroom house. That's more bedrooms than people. Okay, so the other thing we want to look at is housing criteria. So in terms of housing criteria, we want to look at some of the scoring criteria. We talked about current living conditions. This is factored into a score. So am I overcrowding situation? Am I in temporary housing? Is this substandard housing? We would need a third-party report for that too, because we don't accept pictures. I can go on the internet and type moldy house, Google it, print out a picture, and tell Andrew, this is my house. There's no way Andrew could verify that. So we need some kind of, either Andrew goes to the house and verifies, or we get a third party like Health Canada to verify that. Okay, so we don't accept pictures. You know, again, somebody could Google that. We do affordability analysis. We look at making sure household size, and then must adhere to, and then you're assigned a score, okay? And then abandoned units, anything abandoned more than 30 days. The other abandonment is under the transfer. If you don't come back after 4 years, it's considered abandoned. So normally abandoned units in Northern Ontario, like Kenora, you're gonna know right away a house is abandoned, right, in the winter, because, you know, hasn't been shoveled in a month, you know, and there's no way to get to the driveway. So you know it's abandoned. So anything 30 units, we give them 15 days to confirm the residency. And if they don't get back to us, so we email them, Facebook them, text them, we priority post, we show that we've done everything to communicate with the tenant. If we don't hear from them within that 15, then we change the locks and it's reallocated to another band member. Again, we don't like to see, especially when there's a mass shortage of housing on reserve. It's hard to swallow when we drive by a community and there's an empty house, perfectly good condition, and it's just empty sitting there. So we only make sure the houses are being used. Again, fires do happen. These are some of the stuff I put in fires. If it's accidental fire, we normally put in the policy that the First Nation will pay the deductible. However, I always ask the band, what if it's negligence, willful negligence, you know, smoking, cooking, whatever, barbecuing in the house, you know, something that was, you know, negligent on their part. Should there be some consequence to their action? And some bands say, no, what we'll do is, so some bands say, okay, we'll make the tenant pay the deductible, which is, you know, sometimes $5,000. Or some of the tenants, some bands where they've been through a fire and it was because of the band member, the tenant did it, and they moved the tenant back in. Now they're saying, okay, no, Scott, you started a fire, you were smoking in bed, that was negligence. Guess what? You know what? You're going to go to the bottom of the list. We're going to rebuild this house for another band member. So you're evicted, and you have to sit out maybe 2 or 5 years before you can reapply. Again, that's up to each individual. There's no law that says you have to do this. I just posed that question. You know, should there be some consequences for somebody's actions? Again, death of a tenant, if you don't, under rental housing, we use the INAC rules, IS rules against spouse, adult children, legal guardian, parents. So we go down that list. Rental one's a little bit different. Because we have that ownership, the band can honor a will. So that means as long as I've willed it to another band member, the beneficiary will inherit the rental, the house and the rental payments. And by the way, Under rental housing, normally under rental own, the tenant would inherit the arrears too, because that's part of the whole ownership. Again, some band members buy life insurance for rent to own. So if there is life insurance, it'll pay out that portion of that mortgage for that particular house. And it has happened a number of times in Ontario where under rental owned band members have done that. Okay, marital breakdown, always a fun part of housing. Not my favorite subject, not the favorite subject of most chief and councils. But again, the way I write the policy, if there's marital breakup, if they're both band member spouses and there's children involved, what I say is the original tenant who's on the application would get awarded as long as they're a band member, unless children are involved. So the way I write my policies is, if there's marital breakup, the children do not go homeless. One of the parents has to, but not the children. Who's ever granted custody of the band member children, then they're the ones who get the right to rent a unit. Again, if they're both First Nation members, there's no children, then we score both applications if they can get involved. Again, if you're unable to agree, we'll score both of you. So there's kind of a lot of clauses within. And then rental one, same thing. If it's a non-band member spouse, either under rental own, they can actually sign on the rent to own, but they sign as legal guardian of the children until the children reach the age of 18. And then it's only the band member children that can exercise that rental right, rent to own option. Okay, so there is chance that a non-band member could get the house, not own it, but rent it, as long as they're band member children. If the spouse is non-band member and the children are non-band member, it'll go to the band member. So it's the band member always first choice unless children are involved. So there's kind of a lot of rules into this. You have to read it very carefully and kind of comply with the matrimonial real property. That's why on some, if it's a non-band member, especially on death of a tenant, I usually say, okay, they can live there at least 180 days, which is kind of the standard under the matrimonial real law, which is 6 months. So we look at that. So we kind of make it the same, consistent. So you don't have to memorize all these dates. So this is not my favorite topic on rental properties, but something that you're going to have to deal with. And it's important that you have these policies to deal with them. Again, default, what are we looking for in a default policy? Well, again, we want to go 10 days, 20 days, final notice after 30 days. That gives them up to 40 days before, and kind of that's the standard I work with. I've seen some going as far as 90 days, which I think is a little too long, but I think 30 days is the standard. Again, we want to avoid any eviction time, get them to sign a repayment plan. One of the things I work with is habitual people who are always late, habitual rent payers that are late. So what we do is, if you receive maybe 3-second notices in a fiscal year, you're automatically evicted. So this is grounds for automatic eviction because you've gone into arrears 3 times, 20 days or more during the fiscal year. That's one way to stop people from abusing the system. Then if you're on social assistance, you got to let them know. Evictions, beside rental arrears, why would someone, well, making a false declaration or housing application that results in housing. Maybe I put down, I got 5 kids. Well, you know what? I'm going to score very high. If I move into the house, there's no kids. Well, I lied on my application. I don't have the kids. So I would get evicted. Again, that's kind of an extreme example. Any person convicted of trafficking drugs or illegal activities from a banned unit will be evicted. Tenants causing ongoing disturbances, willful damage of property, neglect, abandon, public nuisance disturbance. Now we've coined a new term too. We have willful damage where someone gets 3 notices, you busted your window. But we've been running to some areas where tenant has destroyed the unit. And we coined the term extraordinary willful damage. What does that mean? That's where the tenant has completely destroyed the house. So in that instance, we put a clause in there. If it exceeds something like $4,000 or $5,000 damage, guess what? It's automatic eviction, no notice. And by the way, we're going to put that $5,000 damage as an accounts receivable from you, so that if you come back in 5 years, it's still going to be on the books. So these are some of the new stuff that we're seeing out there. Again, public nuisance, causing a disturbance, all of that can be factored. Maintenance responsibilities, again, major capital items, roofs, windows, doors. Again, I always tell bands you should do a maintenance brochure. In my housing policies, I do provide my clients with a maintenance brochure. Tenant responsibilities, again, you should do a tenant handbook. In my housing policies, we do provide a tenant handbook that complements the housing policy, highlights all the responsibilities, keep the unit area clean, free of garbage and junk cars. So when I'm saying junk cars, I'm talking about Fords. Not that I drive a Ford. Again, responsible for costs to do due to negligence and tenant abuse. And the other question I get a lot on from community members, what if my friend, my cousin who came and visited me for the weekend kicks down the door and busts the window? Who's responsible? Well, you are. Guess what? You're also responsible for any guests that come to your house. And if they do any destruction or destroy your abandoned property, at the end of the day, it's your responsibility because you're on the hook for you got to make sure you mind your guests that do come. Okay, inspection. This is very important in a housing policy. This is probably what's going to make or break your housing program in terms of how long these. So we got to do a move-in inspection. And I always recommend this is where you do a mini maintenance workshop. This is how you change a stove element. This is how you reset the breaker. This is how you change the furnace filter. This is how you clean the HRV. And then, by the way, we're going to do annual inspections. This is how you plunge a toilet. All of this would be taught to them so that they know their responsibilities. And then we're going to do annual inspections, watch for tenant-related damage, making sure that we follow up with them. Again, transfer the unit on a rent-to-own, like at the end of the 25-year or whatever the period is. You have to be a band member, have no arrears, not in breach of the rent-to-own agreement, and then you take on all responsibilities of homeownership, including insurance and maintenance, okay? Then I always put in an appeal process, so maybe 15 days, you should come in right away. Then we try to handle it internally with staff and then housing committee. And then finally, chief and council. It has to be a legitimate appeal. It can't be, Andrew hates me. That's not an appeal. It has to be something in the housing policy, error in fact, omission of policy, procedural error, or if he thinks it's unfair or unjust. Again, you got to go back to the housing policy. So again, we want to make, not every appeal should go to council. If it's one of those, I think Andrew hates me, well, you know what, that's not an appeal. So again, it has to be legitimate. When I used to help out with appeals, I would just tell the tenant, here's the housing policy, show us where we went wrong. That's kind of how I handle appeals. And then under renovations, we do put stuff in there like their CMA external programs like CMHC, RAP, HASI, revolving loan programs, any First Nation programs or bank lending programs. And then we do home ownership policy. So I do First Nations Market Housing Fund. They do quite a bit of housing policies through a First Nation. Any bank loan programs, revolving loans, Section 10. So you would put policies in place. Again, very quickly, that's kind of my presentations, kind of 20 years worth of housing. I found it difficult. Normally, this is a one-day training session. We squeeze it in 45 minutes to kind of get everything that I thought was very important. There are obviously a lot more clauses than this, but I kind of simplified it. There's my contact information. I'm based out of Wikwemokong. I do quite a bit of stuff through Zoom. And then I don't know if tenants, these are kind of the advisory services or training I do. So if anybody has any questions, I guess that's the next part, Andrew.
Yeah, I've got some questions here.
Okay.
The first one is there a name for the home assessment process that you follow? Do you know if any assessments follow EnerGuide?
Okay, for the EnerGuide program, most of them use the EnerGuide. So when you're talking, are you talking about like air blower test and testing the how airtight the houses? Is that what you're talking about, Andrew?
I'm not too sure. It doesn't specify in the question here.
Okay, the only one I'm aware of on older units, they use a blower door test and then they balance the HRV. On newer houses, they wouldn't need to do a blower door test because they're built so airtight now that you wouldn't need a blower door test. Okay.
Someone was asking if your PowerPoint presentation is available in a PDF download.
Yeah, we can send it to First Nations Housing. That's what I was going to ask, if this is available to the participants. Yes, I'll send it to you, Andrew. Then you could probably make it available on your website or something.
Perfect, that'd be great.
Yep.
Another question here is, what's the best strategy to implement a new housing policy? Well,
actually, that's a good question. One of the main ways to implement a housing is actually through communications. It's very important that you hold community meetings, you do mail outs, you tell band members 6 months in advance, this is the new housing policy, you do community meetings. Again, you do the tenant handbook, the maintenance brochure, so that when it's time to implement the new housing policy, there's no surprises, because they have. And then I also recommend that you bring in the new tenants that are subject to the 3 months before, 90 days, they'll go over the lease, go over the housing policy, Again, this is where it's important to do a tenant handbook and a maintenance brochure, so they're aware of all the responsibilities.
I've got another one here. It's how do you explain to a member when you're asking what the purpose of an annual inspection?
Okay, yeah, I get that question because if you've never done annual inspections, a lot of the biggest expectation is that, well, housing's here, that means everything's going to get fixed. And that's not true. We're only there to fix health and safety items. One of the things I tell the housing manager is get the homeowner to explain to the homeowner that these annual inspections are to look for health and safety issues. We want to make sure if there are any issues, we want to be, if you're not telling us, we want to make sure we're seeing, maybe it's something you don't know what to look for, but it's something we're going to do on an annual basis. Again, it's not, I realize some tenants feel it's intrusive, but it's a necessary thing because a house is a banned asset. Just like your dump truck or a banned grader, you have to take it in every year, get inspected, get oil changed, get new tires. Well, the house is the same thing. It's a banned asset. Okay.
Another question here is how do we determine the rent cost?
Well, if it's a CMHC rental, they usually determine that by the MRC, minimum revenue contribution. Again, there's no income testing. If there's no mortgage, I normally factor in maintenance of about and a replacement reserve. Again, anywhere from $500 to $600 a year per unit for maintenance if there's no CMHC involvement. And then one of the things that I like about the CMHC program, and if it's a non-CMHC, I still think you should set up a replacement reserve because again, you know, in 20 years, that roof's gonna go, that window's gonna go, even if the tenant didn't break it, the stuff wears out. And then at least you put aside money every year for that unit so that it can be repaired.
Well, that's great, Scott. We are running a little short on time. I know we started late, but what I'm going to do is maybe we can direct some of these extra questions to you and they can be answered at a different time if that works.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think we're going to move on to the passport to prizes segment.
Okay, thank you, everybody.
Thanks. They're just going to do the passport to prizes segment. If everybody can take note of the code word to use for your passport prizes. So the code is house. Again, I'd like to thank Scott for his presentation. I know there's a lot of good information and for everyone who participated and joined us in this session.